This movie is a thrilling and intense story about manipulation, betrayal, and obsession. The movie follows high school student Jamie Hall, who gets caught in a web of lies and deceit when her new teacher, Mrs. Molly Matson, develops an unhealthy obsession with her boyfriend, Danny. What begins as a simple school year turns into a nightmare for Jamie, with deadly consequences. Jamie Hall is a smart and hardworking high school student. She has a supportive boyfriend named Danny and a bright future ahead of her. The two have been together for a while, and they share a strong bond. Things are going well for Jamie, and she is excited to finish school and move forward with her life. At the start of the school year, a new teacher arrives at their school, Mrs. Molly Matson. She is young, attractive, and popular among the students. She quickly becomes a favorite teacher because of her friendly and understanding nature. However, behind her charm, Mrs. Matson hides dark intentions. Mrs. Matson seems nice at first. She shows a lot of interest in her students, especially Danny. She praises his work in class and offers him extra help after school. At first, Jamie thinks nothing of it, believing her teacher is just being helpful. But soon, Mrs. Matson's attention toward Danny starts to feel strange. Danny begins spending more time with Mrs. Matson, and Jamie starts to notice that he is pulling away from her. He doesn't seem like himself anymore. Mrs. Matson encourages Danny to stay after class, and even invites him to help her with projects outside of school hours. Jamie becomes uncomfortable but doesn't want to jump to conclusions. As Mrs. Matson grows closer to Danny, her behavior becomes more inappropriate. She sends him personal text messages late at night, acting more like a friend than a teacher. Mrs. Matson slowly manipulates Danny, making him feel special and important. She tries to isolate him from Jamie, planting doubts in his mind about their relationship. Jamie feels like something is seriously wrong, but when she talks to Danny, he brushes off her concerns. He insists that Mrs. Matson is just helping him with his studies. Jamie, however, is not convinced and begins to suspect that there's more going on. Determined to find out what's really happening, Jamie looks through Danny's phone and discovers inappropriate messages between him and Mrs. Matson. The texts reveal a growing closeness that crosses the line between teacher and student. Jamie confronts Danny, who denies that anything is wrong. He believes that Mrs. Matson is simply being nice to him. Frustrated and scared, Jamie decides to confront Mrs. Matson. However, the teacher turns the situation around and makes Jamie seem like the one who is jealous and overreacting. Mrs. Matson continues her manipulation by playing the role of the perfect teacher in front of the school staff, fooling everyone. As Jamie grows more isolated, Mrs. Matson becomes bolder. She spends more time with Danny, manipulating him further. Mrs. Matson tells Danny that Jamie is trying to come between them and that she doesn't really care about him. Danny, confused and under the teacher's influence, starts to believe her lies. Mrs. Matson knows Jamie is getting closer to exposing her, so she takes steps to protect herself. She begins spreading rumors about Jamie at school, telling the administration that Jamie is harassing her out of jealousy. The school starts to side with Mrs. Matson, and Jamie feels completely powerless. Realizing that Danny is starting to pull away from her, Mrs. Matson becomes desperate. She cannot bear the thought of losing control over him, so she decides to take extreme measures. One evening, after a heated argument between her and Danny, Mrs. Matson follows him in her car as he walks home. Danny, still confused and upset by everything, doesn't notice Mrs. Matson trailing him at first. She drives slowly behind him, her mind racing with anger and jealousy. As Danny walks down a quiet road, Mrs. Matson speeds up, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She can't let Danny leave her. She believes that if she can't have him, no one can. Suddenly, Mrs. Matson floors the gas pedal and drives straight toward Danny. He hears the roar of the engine behind him and turns around, but it's too late. Mrs. Matson hits him with her car, throwing him to the ground. Danny dies on impact, and Mrs. Matson flees the scene, leaving him alone in the dark street. After killing Danny, Mrs. Matson realizes that she needs to cover her tracks. She devises a plan to make it look like Jamie was responsible for Danny's death. The next day, Mrs. Matson goes to the police and claims that Jamie was threatening her and Danny for weeks. She lies, saying that Jamie was obsessed with Danny and that she warned him to stay away from her. The police begin investigating, and with Mrs. Matson's convincing story, Jamie becomes the prime suspect. Everyone believes that Jamie, out of jealousy and anger, must have been involved in Danny's death. Jamie, devastated by Danny's loss, now has to fight to clear her name while grieving for the boy she loved. Even though the evidence seems stacked against her, Jamie refuses to give up. She knows Mrs. Matson is behind Danny's death and is determined to prove it. Jamie and her best friend begin investigating, searching for anything that can expose the teacher's lies. Jamie eventually finds a witness who saw Mrs. Matson's car near the scene of Danny's death that night. With this new evidence, Jamie goes to the police. However, Mrs. Matson, in a final attempt to protect herself, tries to destroy the evidence. But Jamie and her friend have one last piece of proof: the recorded conversations between Mrs. Matson and Danny. In these recordings, Mrs. Matson admits to manipulating Danny and expresses her obsessive feelings for him. The police listen to the recordings and finally realize the truth. Mrs. Matson is arrested, and her crimes are exposed. Jamie, though still grieving the loss of Danny, is finally vindicated. Mrs. Matson is brought to justice for both her manipulation and the murder of Danny.